All right, Logan, question number 4. Simplify each radical. Our first one, we have the square root of negative 121. And all we have to remember is that anytime there's a negative inside of the square root sign, turn it into I. All right, now don't make the negative an I, make the square root of negative 1 an I. So what am I saying? I'm trying to say that the square root of 121, negative 121, is the same as the square root of 121 times the square root of negative 1. And we know that by definition, the square root of negative 1 is just I, the imaginary unit. So this just tells me, hey, this is an imaginary number, right? So you know it's an imaginary number because there's a negative under the radical. So we just say it's an imaginary number and we write I down. And then we simplify the square root of 121, which is 11. So our answer is 11I. Or you could just say our answer is a complex or an imaginary 11, right? Which sounds weird to say, but that's the way it simplifies. All right, let's try this again. Question B, square root of negative 63. Since there's a negative in there, I know that my answer is going to be an imaginary number. So I'm going to say that this answer is going to be the square root of 63, but it's just going to have an I with it to indicate that it's an imaginary number. So we have the square root of 63I. Now we simplify the square root of 63 the same way we would simplify any radical, is we have to find perfect squares. Now 63 is 9 times 7. All right, 9 times 7. Now some people will ask, why do I write 9? And the reason is because 9 is a perfect square, rather than choosing something like 3 and 21, where neither of the numbers are perfect squares. The reason is I can simplify the square root of 9. That is just 3. I can't simplify the square root of 7, so we just leave it as such. And the I indicates that the original problem had a negative under the radical sign. So we retain that I to indicate that it was originally a negative under the radical sign. Moving on to question C, 5 square root negative 12. Once again, a negative under the radical indicates to us that we have an imaginary number, so we should write that immediately. So all right, 5 square root of 12, I. That means whatever we do now is just like normal numbers, except our answer at the very end will say, hey, we have a complex answer, I. Now 12 is 4 times 3. I choose that rather over 6 times 2 because 4 is a perfect square. So we have 5 square root 4 square root 3. We have 5 square root of 4 is just 2 square root of 3 and I. Now this looks weird because it looks like I'm saying 552. It looks like I say 52 square root 3. But we all know that 5 and then that right there is multiplication. 5 times that. So it's not 5 times 2 is 52, but 5 times 2 is actually 10. So we get 10 square root of 3I, where I just tells me we had a negative under the radical when we first started this problem. Question D. Oh, you tricky little negative sign. So that negative sign right there is not under the radical, which tells us there is no I, because if it was, it would have been underneath the square root sign. So we write negative, and then we just simplify it. Square root of 9, square root of 2. We know the square root of 9 is 3, so we get 3 square root of 2. But there was a negative in front, so we leave the negative to indicate that there was a negative in front of the radical, kind of like the negative under the radical. Okay, but when there's a negative under the radical, we change it to an I to indicate that. All right, I'll see you on the next problem.